How can we cut across this dichotomy of subjective and objective rather than choose between one or the other?
Gibson, I think, on the shoulders of somebody like William James and a few others, I'll mention John Dewey as well, really have offered a revolution in our thinking to think relationally, not dualistically. Immediate experience points both to the experiencer and that which is experienced. And when we use particular language, we should try to be as clear as possible. If you use a term in lots of different ways, before long, the term has no meaning anymore. So what are affordances? They're relational properties. They're properties of the environment defined relative to an active organism. Let me just say one thing about the paper you mentioned, affordances in the body. The purpose of that was that back at the time it was written, there were several people writing about affordances who said affordances might apply to grabbing tools and objects and glasses, but it has nothing to do with culture. And that paper is completely to refute that argument, that we can extend affordances to the cultural domain and the meanings in the cultural domain while being consistent with the approach of ecological psychology. We perceive by moving through the world. So if we think about navigation as moving through the world, what happens is we detect information as we move through it. A map has great utility, but we don't need a map to find our way. It's a tool and it can help us. Animacy is the most essential quality of living things. The problem historically is we've been stuck only in that second area. Think about how Descartes even starts his meditations. He's reflecting about himself. He's not reflecting on the world. The environment is not in the head.
Hello, everyone. I'm glad you're here. Today we have a really special guest named Harry Heft, who is legendary in circles in environmental and ecological psychology. What those terms mean, we will talk about here with Harry. For those of you who are big JJ Gibson fans, you might be thrilled to learn that Harry Heft knew Gibson and even drove him to work every day for a while when he was a student, asked by Eleanor Gibson, by the way, another prominent scientist. And during that time, they discussed today's topic, which is affordances, that has a lot to do with this subject-object meeting place that is beyond both subject and object in these direct perception ideas where perception and action can be seen kaleidoscopically as one process. Harry and I mentioned navigation, cognitive maps, and wayfinding. And wayfinding is a specific term that's used in neuroscience and psychology. You could best understand it as ascertaining your position and then planning and following a route. And that's different from this term waymaking, which you might hear sometimes, which is a more general term that I use just to mean moving through the encounter. It doesn't require planning or routing or anything. Can include that, but doesn't have to. It's just embodied movement or movement in bodies. But that's a topic for another time. Today is all about Harry Heft and his amazing life and work and its connection to JJ Gibson, but also to another person I've loved since I was a teenager, William James. He's someone that really influenced Harry too, and in one of his books he traces the path from William James to Gibson. Actually, for those of you who like these kind of literary families, you can actually trace James to Hiott, to Gibson, to Harry, if you really want to. Anyway, the term that we will talk about mostly here is affordances. I wonder, for those of you who work in neuroscience or philosophy or some STEM field, how many times you've heard the word affordances or used it yourself in the last week. It seems to be a term that expresses quite a lot for us these days. And Harry and I discussed whether it's overused. He's one of the first people to talk about affordances, to bring it into popular discourse, so to speak, scientifically. So it's interesting to hear his opinion about whether that word is still meaningful. We're mid-December now. As the year winds down, I hope everything's going well for you and it's not stressful and you're looking forward to the holidays, whatever you're going to do, see family or just read a good book, take a walk, something nourishing and with delightful affordances. I'm really glad that I got to know you this year, or that we've come into contact this year. I appreciate you being here and listening and all that you do. Thank you for supporting this show and this research, signing up for Substack or YouTube or whatever you do, even just thinking of it in a good way. Thanks for that. Hello, Harry. Thank you for being here. It's really wonderful to see you today.
Yeah, thank you. It's nice to see you again. Thanks for the invitation.
Yes, it's my honor. I'm really fascinated by so much of your work. Today, we're going to focus on this term affordance, which in many different fields I work in, I hear used all the time. And many of us in psychology and philosophy know that word associated with your work and with Gibson. So this is where I want to start today. You have such an amazing reputation relative to ecological psychology, environmental psychology. For those who don't know these terms, maybe we could start with what is environmental psychology or ecological psychology? Are these different? How would you approach those two words, disciplines, fields?
Yeah. If I may, may I start with just a little bit of autobiography to explain this? So I think most of us are products of the times in which we grew up. And when I was when I was a student, a graduate student, it was the time of the first Earth Days. And it was prompting attention to the relationship between, human activity and environmental quality. And there were a group of psychologists then who were kind of late in their career, but they thought psychology needs to get engaged in environmental issues. And they came together and they started a field called environmental psychology, which is a pretty big umbrella term. And that's what initially hooked me. It was a time of environmental activism, and it's like, okay, this appeals to my late adolescent mind. So let's get engaged in this. And so it's a pretty sprawling field. I ended up going to a graduate program, which was an interdisciplinary program on environmental studies and psychology and planning and so on. And what I was interested in at the time was the relationship between the quality of environments and human development, particularly child development. And because my view at the time, which is kind of this sort of sophomoric approach to things, is how can we make environments optimal for child development? So starting there and within the umbrella of environmental psychology, I thought, well, let me see how psychology treats the environment. And that's when I became really frustrated because it leads to, I think, a couple of directions which were not helpful for my applied interests, and then ultimately for my theoretical interests. One of which, when it's instilled that there's two threads, and they're both dominant, and they're kind of related. One is to define the environment in physical terms, as a physical scientist might, which has great value. There's no question about that. But then, is that the best way to approach thinking about the environment when it comes to psychological problems? I was doubtful. And then the other thread, and it kind of stems from the first one, is people arguing that, well, we experience the environment subjectively. In the environment we experience is in our head, and the person variables matter a lot. Well, the person I was studying with at the time, who kind of helped shape my early thinking, wrote this great essay to environmental psychologists with the title, "The Environment is Not in the Head." Okay. He said,
Great.
you need to look elsewhere. I mean, there's going to be connections, but like, how do we conceptualize the environment? And that's when he steered me in the direction of James Gibson's work. So Gibson developed ecological psychology, which is different from environmental psychology for theoretical reasons. Environmental psychology is somewhat atheoretical. I mean, it's sort of a grab bag of different approaches to try to see how we can answer a particular problem. But Gibson was concerned about the fact that indeed the environment is not in the head. His philosophical inclinations led him to think that the notion of indirect realism, that is, that we each experience the environment indirectly by way of, let's say, mental representations, was just not sound philosophically. For one thing, and I know this is familiar ground to you, it leads to a position of solipsism. And so we're all trapped in our own private worlds. And so when I went back to my initial question, well, how can we make environments psychologically more better for kids? it can't be thinking about the environment as being in the head, but the environment that's sort of a common ground for all of us. And and this is what Gibson did. And what he did was he provided the grounds for a direct theory of perception that is not perceiving the environment indirectly, but perceiving it directly. And how do you do that? And this is sort of the revelation, and it really redirected all my thinking. I came across this in graduate school.
Do you remember when that happened exactly? Was it one of those moments where it's kind of what you've been looking for?
Absolutely. I mean, I could point to the paragraph in Gibson's 1966 book. I was sitting in my office as a graduate student, and I just about fell on my chair. It's like, oh, that makes perfect sense. I definitely understand all this. And it's really, I mean, he didn't explain it the way I'm about to, but it's really pretty simple. I mean, if you ask, how do we hear? And we can think about the model of like two tuning forks. If you set one tuning fork resonating, how does it cause the other one to resonate? And the answer is not very mysterious. It's that there are vibrations that are set in the air, which travel from one place to another. That we've known that for centuries. But no one ever thought about applying that to vision. And so what Gibson did, building on a few earlier ideas, is he developed the idea of a medium for vision. That is to say that we can think about the air in our room as filled with reflected light. If we're not sitting in the dark, which we're not, neither one of us are right now, there's light coming from a radiant source, like a lamp or something. And that light bounces off of all the surfaces in the environment and creates sort of this steady state of reflective light. And then what Gibson then did is, let's look at what the structure of that reflected light might be. Now, at this point, I won't go down a rabbit hole, but basically what he showed is there's structure in reflected light, which allows you to detect a surface at a distance from you. In other words, there's the possibility for direct real light. And so when I went back to thinking about children, it's like, well, what are the environments that children are directly experiencing? And although in my dissertation, I was looking at physical variables and other things, it became clear that the key to it was, what is it that adults perceive directly? And Gibson's answer to that question is they perceive affordances. Okay, so what are affordances? They're they're relational properties. They're properties of the environment defined relative to an active organism.
Before you go into affordance, because I think there's a lot to discuss there, I just want to try to think big picture about what we're doing or what this is. So we're thinking about experience and perception. Is it safe to say that the kind of main problem is, how do we account for, I think you say meaning in perceptual experience in your work often, this word meaning, but really it's, how is this happening? What are we trying to do with all this?
Well, let me answer by sort of providing one other piece of background. And this will be once I sort of had been working in Gibson's domain for a while, it was always very puzzling to me where these ideas came from. And one day, 30 years ago, I was talking to a colleague in philosophy, and I instantly saw where it came from. And it turns out, for you philosophers that listening, it comes from William James's radical empiricism. For people who aren't philosophers and you've only read James's Principles of Psychology, probably, or Varieties of Religious Experience, but that's not where you're going to find this. You're going to find it in his last essays, where what he does there is reject dualism. He says that immediate experience points both to the experiencer and that which is experienced. So if we perceive whether, and this is referring to an affordance, if we perceive whether an object is graspable, we experience that in our immediate experience. Now we can subsequently reflect that, it has to do with the properties of the object, objective properties, or we can reflect after, it has to do with my experience of grasping things and my body size. But that's not the immediate experience. Those are kind of post hoc analyses. The immediate experience is this object that I can do something with. It's affordance. And although William James does not use the term affordances, that's where radical empiricism begins. It's a complete rejection of dualistic epistemologies. So if anyone wants to get, well, I have to say that my book that was published in 2001, the first half of the book is really justifying that claim.
There's a lot in there I would like to think about. First of all, it's interesting you mentioned James. Did Gibson study with James? With his student or something?
Yeah, the first part of my book was a historical treatment of that question. So James's student toward the end of his career was Edwin Holt.
Oh yeah, that's Holt, it. Okay.
Who was at Princeton, and Gibson was a graduate student at Princeton. So there's a lot of circumstantial evidence which points to the fact that Gibson sort of was exposed to these ideas through Holt.
Okay, that's what I was trying to remember, because I knew there was really a direct connection, not only in ideas, but even in place and people being in similar learning environments. And then you knew Gibson, which we'll get to. But I mean, like this big picture, you're talking about childhood place and how, and a lot of your work thinks about what that is and how to understand that. We can think about what affordances lead to what sorts of paths and ways. I'm trying to think about this big picture of we're in the world and it feels like everything is in our head somehow. There's this idea that perception is in the head. I'm being very general. Or it's a matter of something physical in the environment that's causing something. So there's always been this either or. It's either subjective, it's about me and my experience in my head, or it's objective, it's something happening in the world. And it's been very hard for us to hold those things as not opposites. And I think what Gibson does and in your work and James, even though it might seem sometimes it's one way or the other, even radical empiricism can sound really on one side. But if you really dig into it, from my perspective, it's actually showing a way that both of these are interacting in some kind of dynamism. How do you think about that?
Even that sounds too dualistic to me.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So
good.
So let me just say something about behaviorism, which some people take very negatively as being reductionistic, but there's another kind of behaviorism, which is sort of what organisms do as whole organisms. So imagine, and this is just a hypothetical, you put a child on the floor with a bunch of objects. Well, they're going to crawl around, and that's important. And I'll come back to that. But what they're going to do is they're going to interact with things that they can meaningfully touch or lift or grab. And so kids will grab objects that are compatible with their hand span and so on. In other words, they engage the world in terms of objects that have properties that are suitable and scaled to their body and scaled to their skills. So the objects that they grab, they are affordances because they point both to the object itself and to the possibilities for action of the individual. So part of the difficulty for traditional philosophers is, okay, let's start with the mind, because that's where Descartes told us to start. But a behaviorist of the stripe that I like says, no, let's begin with action, with behavior. And in fact, among philosophers, that's where Merleau-Ponty starts. He starts with action. Yeah. So what is it that we're engaging, and what are the properties of those things we engage? And Merleau-Ponty didn't use the term affordances, but he and Gibson really fit together quite nicely.
Oh yeah, there's so many terms in phenomenology that fit very well with the idea of affordance, and you bring that out actually in the paper, which I think you wrote in 1989, and it's called "Affordances in the Body: An Intentional Analysis of Gibson." Yeah. That one is really famous. I think everyone's read it, and I encourage everyone to go and read it now. But okay, so it is a kind of phenomenological lived experience in the way you described it. The child is going to have a different experience of those objects on the floor than the dog or the cat or the parent. But at the same time, those objects on the floor are the environment. So we have both, and for some reason we feel like we either have to start inside or outside to try to describe it. But I feel like what you are starting to get at with that paper where you bring in Merleau-Ponty is that it's both. When you're talking about action, you're already talking about both.
Yeah.
Body, the situation,
Mm. Yeah.
and
If you start with action in an environment that has things in it, you're not starting inside. You're starting where the individual and the world meet. I mean, it's really if you will, a transactional concept. I prefer transactional than interaction. The
was that the
reasons,
work of the affordance right there? That almost synopsy kind of space of, because an affordance is also not a static thing. It is that relation that you described of the child and the object. We can't put it in the child or the object. Or how would you?
right? But there are some constancies. So, for example, depending on the object, like I have my glass. Get it in the camera. I have my glass right here. I mean, it has some fairly constant properties, and one of it is its width and its weight and so on. And I have some somewhat constant properties in terms of my hand span and my strength, but those are all changeable at, at different time scales.
Yeah. There's patterns, there's regularities that would change with the consistency most of the time. We can
Yeah,
say that, but
right.
yeah, there's not a
So,
static thing. Yeah.
yeah, and the body changes over certain time scales. My colleague Karen Adolph of New York University looks at how children's decisions about locomotion change as their body size changes, as their skills change. So there, the world is dynamically changing, but the thing we have to remember is different aspects of it change at different rates. So the glass on my desk is relatively stable. My body will be slowly changing, but things go, entropy does win out in the end.
Right.
Yeah.
So when we're trying to understand what's happening, when we're trying to understand the meaning and how we have meaning and how this happens, this amazing life that we're living, and affordances starts to do some work for us in a way, and also thinking of it more ecologically in terms of ecological psychology, where we're not just looking at the brain or just looking inside or just looking outside. How would you start to think about what that's doing and how that's helping us with this problem?
Yeah. Well, let me drag my prop in again. So,
Yeah, I
there we
have
go.
one too. We can cheers with
Yeah.
our water.
Cheers. Yeah. And that is because of its properties in relationship to my body. It's meaningful. It's graspable. If you will, it has the affordance of being graspable or graspability. The terms get a little clunky, although I guess it's not uncomfortable for German speakers to have these long extended words. In English, it gets a little weird, but we can talk about what an object or a feature affords an individual. And so some of the work that I did more I dabbled a little bit in design and with some landscape designers. And if we want to design a space where people might gather, we want to design a space where people can sit. So how high should you make these seats or these ledges or these benches? Well, it should be relative to the body scaling of the people who are going to sit there. So in other words, these structures afford sitting on. I'm sure we've all been in places where there are things that look like you could sit on it, but they're too high or too small or so on. So the property of being the affordance of sittableness, if you will, is defined relative to the person who's going to be doing the sitting. It's not in the person, it's not in the object, but it takes into account both parts of that, I would say, duality, not dualism.
So is it almost a practice of a different kind of noticing or a different kind of
Sure.
coming at this problem or this project of looking for meaning and building for meaning and creating spaces that are meaningful?
I'll give you an example. One of my closest friends here is a philosopher. And for years, we kind of argued over what affordances were. And then he and his wife had twins. And then the twins got old enough to crawl around the house. And they started looking for like light sockets and cracks and sharp edges. And he called me and said, okay, now I know what affordances are.
Oh, well. Can I ask, what did he think they were before? What was the argument?
It's really been a long time, but they just seem to be mysterious. I mean, if you say to someone, well, there's this thing here, but it's neither in the person or in the world, it's like, well, what are you talking about?
Isn't that because we are kind of born into a dualistic framework? Not that the
Absolutely.
dualistic framework is somehow ordained by God or something, but it's just the way we've built our science and our language, not
Yeah.
without good reason, to try to understand it. But isn't that why it doesn't make sense? Because we think we have to put it in one of those boxes, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It also goes back to the influence of Judeo-Christian thinking, that there's sort of the world and then there's the mind, and the world is sort of is not necessarily sacred. We can do things to the world. We can dig big holes in it and blow it up. But the mind is, next to God. So we have this dualism that comes from our religious tradition. And then Descartes, for really good reasons, tried to solve some problems. And we've been stuck in that framework for a long time. So, I mean, Gibson, I think, on the shoulders of somebody like William James and a few others, I'll mention John Dewey as well, really have offered a revolution in our thinking, to think relationally, not dualistically. Now, but I want to add one thing, and that is, and this of course is in James's work, that we do act in the world, over time, but there are moments when we kind of step back from that action and reflect, and we reflect on it. We engage in cognition too, but it's important to distinguish between perceiving as a process in the course of perception action in time, and reflection or cognition, which is kind of stepping out of time a little bit. The problem historically is we've been stuck only in that second area. So, think about how Descartes even starts his meditations. He's reflecting about himself. He's not reflecting on the world.
Yeah. I think it's almost like such a kind of awe and mysterious experience that we have the experience of the world, and then we can experience our experience of the world.
Yeah.
Which I think is continuous in a way, like even with your work, and we can even understand that reflection as a kind of perception of our own perception and so forth. But I won't go down that rabbit hole. But it is understandable that we get kind of amazed by it.
Yeah. And one other thing, let's remember with Descartes is, he was interested in trying to get to the topic of certainty and truth. He wasn't asking about the world. He was asking about epistemology in those very influential essays. But things have gotten sort of balled up over time, particularly for psychologists.
Yeah, there's a lot of assumptions that we all start with as if they're facts without realizing that we do. And a lot of this work ends up trying to call that into question, which I think is something that Gibson does just by offering another way to think about it. But then that gets cartooned too, in the sense of, well, it can't all be direct because, yes, obviously there is something going on inside. But as you're saying, the point isn't that there's not something going on inside. It's how can we, he even says it in one of my favorite quotes, like, how can we cut across this dichotomy of subjective and objective, right? How can we hold both those at once rather than choose between one or the other?
We do it all the time. When we're in the world engaging objects, when when we're talking to other people, we're not, the dialogue is happening between us. Now, and we're each bringing something to that dialogue, but the dialogue exists relationally. Now we can step back, and after our phone call, we can reflect on what we said, but that's not perceiving. That's an act of reflection or cognition, and that's legitimate.
That's not perceiving yourself. This is something I get
I don't
confused
think so.
about too, like with perception, where everyone puts the limit on it.
Okay.
I'm thinking about what I said to you. I feel like I'm still perceiving my own habits or patterns in a way.
Well, yeah, but let's go back to my earlier comments about the medium. Yeah, so it's the basis for our sort of existing in a common medium that enables us to interact. And if we're talking about vision, that medium is reflective light, then we can talk much more specifically about the character of that.
That's a good point. In your paper, I think you quote Gibson about these poles of attention
Yeah,
quote, which is just wonderful, right? Because
right.
that's what you're saying, right? The pole of attention shifts from so-called subjective to so-called objective.
Yeah. Or that's right. Or I would say from sort of relational engagement to much more inward engagement. Yeah.
Or
So,
relational with self engagement. Yeah.
yeah. So, I mean, we know a common complaint in relationships is that one person says, well, you're really not listening to me. You're really thinking about what you're going to ask.
You're listening to your own thoughts, not
Yeah. Well,
mine.
that's fine, but that's not dialogue. Is it real? Sure. Is it important? Sure. But it's not dialogue. So we really want to talk about this dynamic exchange that goes on between us.
I'm trying to remember also in that paper when you talk about, because it's wonderful and in the way that you show that relational is an alternative to this dualistic way of thinking. And I feel like one part of it that was really strong for me is when you're talking about the continuity. And this gets into something I want to go into with you too about how we confuse our maps for our territories or the maps for the
Right.
process. But what I remember is when you're talking about relationality, you're talking about the continuity and that everything is ongoing and moving in a process. But with the dualistic point of view, we always freeze it into little static parts. And it's almost as if something starts and stops. But all of this is always ongoing in a process. We never get to have a beginning or end. Isn't that part of when you're talking about relationality and the difference between the
Sure.
dual?
But yeah, let me return to let's take something simple, and that is like perceiving an object. So if you walk into a room and there's an object on the table and you don't know what it is immediately, what do? You walk closer to it, you walk around it, you look from different vantage points. From an ecological point of view, what you're doing is you're sort of isolating the specifying information that tells you what that thing is. I mean, organisms move. I mean, in frankly, we organisms didn't begin perceiving; they began moving. Animacy is the most essential quality of living things, even single-celled organisms. And then subsequently in evolutionary history, we developed these means to actually cease to detect things that are maybe at a distance from us, visually, auditorily, and also through smell. But we want to begin with animacy. We want to begin with action. And that leads me back to what I said a minute ago. We want to be good molar behaviorists, not reductionistic behaviorists. Just look at what an organism is doing. Yeah.
The problem with behaviorism was they didn't take seriously that we have this subjective experience, this thing we call consciousness, which gets called a million things. But behaviorism itself is kind of all of this, right? I mean, it got rejected with the Chomsky article and all that, but
Right. But
the
yeah, I mean, but just remember the behaviorism that most people have been familiar with is a reductionistic one. Let's go down to the
yeah,
most basic unit of something. But that's not the kind of behaviorism I'm talking about.
that's what I'm trying to point out because I think
Looking
some people
at
will
it,
hear that and that's what they think. But
yeah.
that's like the opposite of what you're saying.
No, I mean, go out to the neighborhood playground and watch the kids playing on the equipment. You're a behaviorist. What are they doing? Yeah, and why are they doing what they're doing? And then if you're looking at them playing in the playground, you instantly see that, oh, they're engaging affordances. They're climbing on things and sliding down things. Yeah. So just sort of observing the world, which neither philosophers nor psychologists have been particularly good at, you start to see action and affordances. Yeah, they're right there in front of your face. In fact, you do it all the time.
It is. That's why I brought up this practice of awareness because it's almost like that's the most important part. I think we could say that about a lot of science and writing and philosophy. But there's two open threads here that I really want to explore. And the first, you brought up design, and I know that this term affordance has become a huge thing in design and architecture, and gosh, in every field, everyone's using the idea of affordance. And there's been some other work written about it. Do you? Oh, because in that paper from 1989, you show that it's okay to think of affordance in a different way so long as you're coming from it from this intentional point of view, which connecting to what we were saying about Merleau-Ponty is situating it in the body
Yeah.
and understanding the trajectory, so to speak, or the goal that we're assessing. But how do you feel about this word affordance? Because it's a word I hear all the time in all fields now in different ways. Do you feel like that paper and the way you lay out affordance is the way that it's still being used? And if not, does it bother you?
Well, there are 2 points, but the main thing is, and I don't want to cast aspersions, but unfortunately, decades ago, someone in computer design decided to apply the concept of affordances to what's generally called interaction design. Interaction design means how we engage with computer interfaces. That was a huge mistake because it now it's using the term affordances in a very different way. And that's okay. You can use words any way you want, but we have to be consistent. Otherwise, we're completely confused. So one of the things that I've been trying to do over many decades is to say, here's how we're going to use it in ecological psychology. And I kind of wish others who will use it in different ways would be much more careful. And the reason why is not because I'm trying to be territorial about the term, but if you use a term in lots of different ways, before long, the term has no meaning anymore. It has no value anymore. It applies to all these different things. And that's then, as a scientific concept, it's useless.
Well, I think it relates to also meaning, this word that I keep bringing up, and that if we're really trying to understand the world and the meaning, that's part of what we're trying to do with psychology and philosophy. And in a practical way, how do you talked about kids and the places that we grow up and how that's incredibly important, right? To think about and look at, and how are we
Right.
going to structure that? But once we start using affordance in terms of computer language and stuff, I don't think that it's necessarily wrong, but the kind of the activity that we were just describing of why this was an important new direction kind of gets collapsed, doesn't it? Because we then have forgotten the body, the situatedness, the meaning, all that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, that's exactly right. Exactly right. I mean, until robotics develops a bit further than it is, I mean, there's no body when we're talking about in computer design. And so to use the word affordances in that concept, it just it weakens the term.
It also strengthens it in a weird way in that context that they're using it, because I think the reason we like that word so much is exactly because of this powerful connection to meaning and body and place, and that's what it's carrying with it. And so I think what we want to do when we use that sometimes in AI or computer programming or whatever, these other fields that are different, is we want to take some of that
Yeah.
inertia into it.
Well, but we also want to look current and cutting edge and on
Yeah,
top
that's
of
part of it.
thing. And it sounds like it's a buzzword. If it's a buzzword, it's not going to have much scientific value. Science can't advance on buzzwords. It has to advance with terms that are well defined. And I haven't
Yeah.
defined affordances with greater precision today, because I don't want to go down a sidetrack. But it can be defined mathematically, at least in some cases. It has been.
Well, that kind of goes into something else I want to talk about. But before, I just want to say also that I think it is a very important word, even in this world of robotics, computer programming, because if we could use it the right way there, it's actually could really be very helpful. Because I think if we really think about affordance in the way situated towards a goal with a body, all these things, it actually solves a lot of problems there, because then we realize actually there are affordances, but they're not to the robot or the computer. It's to the person who's doing the programming or so on or so forth. You can get to that place of a body and a situation and all of it. And actually going through that could be really beneficial in the field. So I think there's even more of a reason to not just say, don't use the word, but learn the history of the word, because it could help you actually with what you're trying to describe, and even philosophically to talk about it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll be patient and see how it all develops. Um,
um,
let me just say
mhm,
one thing about the paper you mentioned,
mhm.
affordances in the body. The the purpose of that was that back at the time it was written, there were several people writing about affordances who said, well, affordances might apply to grabbing tools and objects and glasses, but it has nothing to do with culture. And that paper is completely to refute that argument, that we can extend affordances to the cultural domain and the meanings in the cultural domain while being consistent with the approach of ecological psychology.
And that's an incredibly important contribution, and one reason that paper has made such a splash. And also, I really could see that continuing on in this tradition of philosophy of technology or thinking of AI. But of course, that would be a whole other discussion. But just for anyone who might want to follow that, there's something rich there. Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I'm going to be skeptical until I see something. See otherwise.
That's good. But so there's two other things, the idea of wayfinding and navigation and how this relates, because we've talked about trying to understand place, trying to understand the affordances of place, and all of this as how it's making meaning or how perceptual experience is meaningful. And you've talked about this as movement. And so how do we relate this to your work with something like navigation and wayfinding? Because it's almost as if we just start to think of our perceptual experience or even our life as almost like a path or a exploration or a following of another path. Or how would you put those together? How did they come together for you?
Yeah, well, when I use the terms navigation or wayfinding, I literally mean moving from one place to another place. Now we can use wayfinding sort of metaphorically and talk about my search for meaning in life, but that's not how I use the term. I mean, literally, how do we get from here to there? And again, this goes back to what I said at the very outside of our discussion. In environmental psychology, the way in which wayfinding or navigation was studied was assuming that we have maps in our head. In fact, a recent Nobel Prize winner received the award for his work on just saying that the hippocampus in the brain is a cognitive map. I don't doubt the findings about the hippocampus, but I'm critical of it, calling it a cognitive map. I mean, talking about having maps in your head removes us from understanding how we find our way in real environments, how I get from my house to the grocery store 3 blocks away. That's the navigation that I'm interested in. Now, and from a Gibsonian point of view, and I didn't stress this earlier, but it's perception action. It's not just perceiving. So we perceive by moving through the world. So if we think about navigation as moving through the world, what happens is we detect information as we move through it. There are features that are revealed as we move through it. And it's that information that I was most interested. This is the work I did early in my career. But again, it's information that's perceived over time. It's always over time. We can talk about perceiving pictures, but that's a whole different universe. We're talking about perceiving dynamically over time. So that's where my work on navigation started. And I'll leave it at that for now. Yeah.
No, this is great because I don't think you know this. I don't think we talked about this, but I was in a lot of those labs that you're talking about. And I've had a lot of discussions with those same people about this subject, even on this channel. So it's interesting to think about the cognitive map. And here's something that's really hard to talk about, but it's really related to your work and everything we've already been talking about. I think you would say there's no such thing as a cognitive map, and others. Yeah.
No,
Would
I
you
wouldn't
say
say.
that? Okay.
Well, I wouldn't say that. And this connects to something I was mentioning earlier.
Mm-hmm.
I told you, wayfinding. I would navigate from my house to the market several blocks away. But I could sit in my chair and imagine how I can do that. I don't mind calling that a cognitive map. In other words, I'm withdrawn from engaging the world, and I can reflect on the world. And I can try, and certainly we do it all the time when we're walking around cities, right? We're following familiar paths, but let's say a route that's familiar to you is blocked at the moment. Then you might start reflecting on, oh, how else can I get around here? Well, I don't have any trouble with cognitive maps used in that second sense. But to say that cognitive maps are what drives online, ongoing perception action, I think is problematic. Because a map, as you said in a different context, is static. It's frozen.
Mm-hmm.
And even GPS maps, they're limited in scope. So we want to keep the emphasis, as Gibson and others have done, and James did, on experience as being dynamic and over time. I mean, the main contribution of William James in this, if the book that most people might know, The Principle of Psychology, is the stream of thought.
Mm.
It rejects the idea that there are frozen bits and pieces of images in thinking, but that thought goes on. Actually, that's what he said. Mental life goes on,
Mm.
and you can leap forward decades, and that's Merleau-Ponty. Same thing. From what Merleau-Ponty does, what James didn't do, is he includes the body in trying to account for change over time. Yeah. But yeah, we can have a cognitive map. I can sit still and sort of reflect on how I might get someplace. That's an interesting.
Yeah, I think I disagree with both sides of this in a way, and agree with both sides of it, which I guess is fitting with this trying to hold the paradox of subject and objective. Because I do think there are cognitive maps, but they're not in our heads. And I don't even think there's a confusion that I feel is something we've been touching on between when we try to create representations externally, or what you might have think of as analytically maps or objects, languages, documents, things like this, and the ongoing process itself. Do you see any confusion there between, for example, I think you've even talked about it, that from day one, we are thinking about maps in our life. We're encountering actual maps, whether it's on our phone or the old paper ones, or even just diagrams and things like that. So it structures the way that we think about the world. And of course, in that way, we are mapping, but we don't have a cognitive map in our head. Do you see those as two different things? Or
Well, I mean, in some other things I've written, there's culture, there's work in cultural anthropology on places where people don't have maps, and they find their way quite well. Now, so a map has great utility, but we don't need a map to find our way. It's a tool, and it can help us.
but the process, the pattern itself can be, I think, studied and understood in the way that you were describing. We can physically find our way through, the world, wayfinding from A to B. Literally, the body is moving. But if you think of language in terms of something like a landscape, a city is basically a collection of regularities that your body is patterning itself with as it's moving through it. But when we're in a thought space, or when we're moving through something like a book or even memories, isn't there also a similar pattern?
I wouldn't make that leap, because I don't think we know enough about what it. Well, I put it a different way. I don't think I've thought enough about what it means to move through a book as opposed to moving through the world. But I've thought a lot about what it means to move through the world, and it requires my body. It's an action. Yeah. So I think, again, it's sort of similarly to what I was saying earlier about affordances. We have to be careful with our terms. So we can say, "Oh yeah, I'm navigating through a book." Well, is that the same thing as what I mean when I say I'm navigating through the city? I don't think so. So even though we're using the same terms, it doesn't mean that they're supported by the same underlying processes. I think, again, the use of terms is absolutely critical.
I would say if you can separate the way that we're going to try to assess or measure it from the process itself, the patterns might be in common, even though it's a different thing. But we have to be very careful not to just take the metaphor and then put it to all the science that's been done. It doesn't help anything.
I think it's important, and this is probably one of the things I most learned from Gibson, to be careful and consistent with the language that we use. And when we use particular language, we should try to be as clear as possible about it. So let me give you just one example in terms of a book I'm reading now. So this book I'm reading now has time jumps. I'm reading it, and now suddenly I'm back 20 years earlier than I was a minute ago. It's like, that's not navigation in a terrestrial sense. So I could say, I'm navigating through this book that doesn't have a linear narrative. Well, then that's something different. And if I was a psychologist interested in reading, I would like to know how I can do that. But that's
I
not
think
the
it would
problem.
happen the same way that if someone suddenly changed, if you were in a VR city or something and they suddenly changed it to another city,
Yeah.
you would have to readjust, realign with the regularities.
Yeah.
I don't think it's different I think the patterns are very similar. And I actually think this is a way to do what Gibson wanted. And overcome that dichotomy of thinking that something that's in the head is somehow different than the physical. They do share similar patterns. But I agree, we do have to be very careful, because if you use certain terminology in a way, then whatever way everyone's heard that terminology before, they're applying to that.
But also, again, I mean, fundamentally, even though some might not think of me this way, I am a scientist. And so I want to say, okay, I want to talk about, okay, empirically, what do we know about this? Well, there's a very smart ecological psychologist at Brown, Bill Warren, who works in this very large virtual reality space. And he's done studies where he has people go through wormholes. They're in this enclosure and they're walking around, and suddenly they go through a wall and they're at someplace completely different. Now, I'm not going to report on what he found, but I'm saying you can study these things empirically without saying, oh, they're the same. I don't know that they're the same.
There have been studies. There have been studies on the hippocampus, and of course it has a very big role in memory and also in navigation. And there have been experiments designed where you are literally moving through some kind of a virtual space or an informational space. We do still see similar patterns to when you're moving through a physical space. Now, that doesn't mean that it's the same, but it does provide a bit of a link between not thinking of what's happening when we're thinking and remembering and having emotion, and what's happening when we're moving from A to B in the physical world and being physical, as completely different, dualistic, right? There might be a way that they're relational that we just haven't been able to kind of widen our perspective to see yet.
Well, I'd say part of our problem is and this is actually a point Wittgenstein makes. We're trapped with with pictures. We think about things that we're trying to envision. So I would say, if you want to understand, let's say, wayfinding or navigation, the analogy should be listening to music, because music is this structure that unfolds over time. And I would say navigation is similarly a structure that changes over time, although the difference is you move through the environment. So you used the word memory a minute ago. So when I'm walking to this familiar store not far from me, as I go, am I sort of relying on memory? I don't think so. Any more than when I'm listening to a very familiar melody, that every step in the way I have to think about, oh, where's this melody go next? No, that's not it at all. It's a relational structure that unfolds over time. And navigation, I would say, is that as well.
Yeah, I would say that's already a cognitive act. I wouldn't separate that action from being, and perception and cognition, as if they're all separate things. So yes, I think there's a difference when we are aware that we're thinking about something. I'm remembering actively. There's different kinds of memory. The body, when you remember how to ride a bicycle, but you're not thinking about riding a bicycle. There's all these different kinds of memory. And I think when we move through the city, after we've moved through it many times, we're of course not remembering it in that active sense of remembrance, like as if there's a subject. But our bodies engaging in, I would say, active memory. That's, I wouldn't distinguish those in a dualistic way.
But doesn't that indicate that we need to use the word memory with greater care? So
yeah, it needs to be thought of a lot differently.
So when I'm riding a bicycle, why even bring memory into it? What I'm employing is a skill that I've developed over a history, and I just sort of engage it. Even going back to this classic paper written in the 40s by Carl Lashley, one of the famous, there are certain things that happen too quickly. I think he talks about an arpeggio that can't rely on memory in the traditional sense of sort of reaching back and pulling out something that occurred before. It's actually in this paper he wrote called In Search of the Engram, which is a term refers to memory. And he basically says in certain circumstances that there's no memory. It's that the body is sort of has developed a pattern of skilled action. And I think using the term memory there just confuses matters.
I think it might confuse, but it's a confusion we need to work through. I think even to go back to Gibson and the idea of more direct perception. And there's something like ecological memory and ecological perception. And I think the problem that we don't use those words and really think through it and change that, like that's the hard work of changing this framework and these patterns of dualism that we're all stuck in, is we need to rethink that. Like cognition and memory aren't things in the head, and they aren't just our thoughts and images that we have in this kind of way that we are aware of ourselves. They're very, for me, I mean, they're very much the way that the body is in the world. And only later do we get to this point where we feel like we have memories in the sense that we attach them to words and images. And that's a really hard thing to think about. And it's really radical to start thinking about ecological memory in that sense. But for me, it seems like the only way we're ever going to really get beyond these dichotomies that are shaping everything, because they are built in the language. And if we just don't use the language, then we just stay with them, you know?
Well, I recommend, I mean, folks have thought about this a long time, and we neglect classic works at our peril. So if you go back to the 30s, there's a wonderful book written by Frederick Bartlett, British psychologist, called Remembering. He basically says the same thing that you just said, but maybe in different words.
Bartlett.
I mean, yeah. So I'm pretty keen. If you read my work, I'm almost always start with history in it. Because I think that's where we need to begin, as not to stay there, but to sort of build on the insights of others who have sort of made some progress in some area. Yeah.
Yeah, I really like that. I think that's connected to this continuity, right? That we really understand that everything is continuous, and understanding where it's coming from is absolutely essential to understanding how to use it or what it is.
Right.
But we don't really take the time to do that. But I wanted to understand your biography a little, and we've gotten into all these big ideas because can we go back to before you wrote that 1989 paper and when you discovered this thing by Gibson, and how did all those dominoes start to fall? Because I believe you got to know him well, and were you teaching with him or something? Or I have all these kind of ideas of how did all of that begin? And
yeah, well, I wouldn't say that I knew him well. I spent about a year at Cornell, and I interacted with him quite a bit there. In fact, what happened was, so after I finished my graduate work, I was looking around for a job, and the only job I got was a crummy job I didn't want. And I thought, well, why not try to spend some time with Gibson? Because I was just barely learning this stuff. So and this is going to relate to navigation. So when I got up to Cornell, and a bunch of circumstances, I'll make the story short. It turns out that, well, it turns out that he was retired at that point, although he had a weekly seminar, but he was also teaching a course once a week at this other university that was 40 minutes away. And where Cornell is a pretty, in the winter, is a pretty rugged area.
Yeah.
So he was going to teach this, he was going to co-teach a course at this other university during the winter months. And it was an evening course. And so his wife, who is just an eminent psychologist as he, Eleanor Gibson, approached me soon after I got there. And she said, would you mind like being his driver to get to this course? And of course I said, well, yeah, of course I will. Because in fact, I didn't know much about his work. And I thought, great, I'm going to have him in a car for 2 hours every week to talk to him. And so one of the questions that kept coming up for me in our conversations is, how are we finding our way from Ithaca, where Cornell is, to this other city, Binghamton? I mean, how are we even doing this? And that's kind of where my interest in navigation started.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
Did you talk to him about that? Did you?
Oh, sure. And yeah, because at that point, I mean, so if those listeners who maybe have read some Gibson will have only probably read his last book, the Ecological Approach of Visual Perception. When I was there, that book was in manuscript form, and he had already written a bunch of stuff on this question, which I hadn't seen yet. So yeah, so we talked about what he had written about navigation and wayfinding in his
So he was literally working on that as you were having these thoughts. That's quite a weird synchronicity.
Yeah, my whole career is full of luck, and Yeah, no, I saw him in his office, and on the bookshelves are all the chapters sort of stretched. Yeah, the way, and I would read them, and of course I then I could ask him about them because I was really a novice at the time. And so my earliest publications, once I got a faculty position, was trying to test the ideas that were implicit in his writing about navigation and wayfinding. So that's really the first 10 years of my career was mostly on that topic.
And
But
you are a scientist and you have done a lot of work that's scientific, but I wonder at that time, how was that considered? What was because now where I am, there's a lot of love for Gibson, right? Or there's a lot of appreciation, even though there's also a lot of controversy. But I wondered then had you just found someone that no one had heard of, or was he already a big player? What was it like in that time period?
yeah, well, that's turns out that's really an interesting question where it leads. So Gibson published a book in 1950 that made a huge splash for a whole bunch of reasons, which we don't have the time to, I could do it, but we don't have time to go into. And then when he wrote his next book, which was published like 16 years later, he basically disavowed most things he wrote in the first book. But in the meantime, the psychological community had embraced that first book and thought, oh, he's fantastic.
Was the first one, the senses, considered as perceptual?
No, that's the first one's called The Perception of the Visual World.
Okay. I didn't even know about that one. So I read
And
this
when
down.
he wrote the senses as considered as perceptual systems, I mean, he didn't completely reject everything in the first book, but he basically moved away from it. And
Was the
so,
first one more traditionally
exactly.
okay.
Yeah. So then the question becomes, well, how does the psychological audience now react to the second book? And most of them said at the time, and since they bought the first argument, oh, he was smart once, but he's kind of gone off his rocker now. And yeah, so for a long time, that the second book, which was really the main book, The Senses Considered, was sort of treated as interesting but kind of quirky.
Mm.
And then over the next 50 years, people saw, oh no, wait a minute. This is really the heart of his ideas.
Mm.
So if you look at mainstream psychologists, and I can cite some examples, and you see, and if they cite Gibson, you'll almost always see that they cite his 1950 book, which she gave up on. Yeah.
Oh, I did not even know that.
Well,
Because
the other,
I only that was the one that made the difference for me, the senses
yeah,
considered as
there's a parallel story to that, and that is during the time that Gibson was at Cornell, a new faculty member, a seasoned faculty member was hired, namely Ulrich Neisser. And in 1967, Neisser wrote the book on information processing called Cognitive Psychology. It was like the Bible of information processing. And then he went to Cornell and started talking to Gibson, and he said, I was completely wrong. And he wrote a follow-up book. So the same thing happened. I mean, it's like Gibson's work convinced Neisser to move away from most, not all, to be fair, but most of his earlier ideas. But the audience of psychologists who read this work are really reluctant to let go of these old ideas. And why? Because they've done hundreds of experiments based on them. They built an entire career on them. Yeah. So change is slow.
And what is so different about the first book and the second book, if you had to put it in
Of
like
Gibson's?
yeah, if you had to say is it
Yeah.
the directness or?
No, it's mainly that so earlier on, I talked about ecological optics, that is to say, the information in reflected light. That's what comes up in this. That's the
Optic
revolutionary.
flow, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. In the first book, he's talking about the visual image as largely static. He's still largely talking about the retinal image. Except we have although that's not completely fair. He tries to break away from it, but it's mostly still tied to the idea that we have a projection of information on our retina.
Oh, I see.
By
So
then,
it's the vision psychology that you're talking about that sticks
yeah,
to that. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, and so if listeners know Gibson's work on texture gradients, which is really what was really very famous for, it comes at and they're still valid, but it comes out of that first book. But by the second book, he said, "Nah, forget about that, because what I did wrong there is I really didn't talk about the active organism." He considered perceiving from largely, not completely, but largely a stationary point of view. But now let's think about individuals, animals moving around in the world. How does that force us to change our thinking? And that's where the rest proceeds from.
Well, it's amazing, and I can understand how going so deeply as he did probably to write that first book that he would be able to then see it differently. But it's weird how that happens sometimes, that you almost have to completely immerse yourself in what is, and then you see, "Oh, actually, it's this way."
Absolutely.
I don't know if you've had
It's
that experience.
absolutely, you're absolutely right. Neisser did the same thing. It's really an act of courage because, again, imagine you have this great reputation and you decide, no, wait a minute, that wasn't right. Let me try again. That's really remarkable. And it doesn't happen in science very often.
No, it doesn't, and you've brought up time a lot here, and the time can be unfair in a way because all those ideas are important and making a lot of new they're starting a lot of new things and have been for a long time. Your work is one example, right, of all that you've opened up because of that. But over time, he doesn't get to see that. So in that moment, it is really brave. But it might also just be a matter of clarity because if you've really studied deeply and you know what you've studied and you know what you're presenting, you don't have a choice. There's been a lot of scientists and people who've had that experience over time where they just are like, okay, nobody's going to understand for a while, but got to do it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, these ideas that led to this newer work were were clearly gnawing at him for decades. Because let me explain what I mean by that. So the transformation is to think about visual perception as you move through the world. That was, and so in the 1930s, he published a book basically about how we drive a car. What's what's the world look like when we're driving a car? And it's about perceiving over time. In the 19 During the war, he worked for a division of the Air Force, and the main question was how do pilots perceive the ground as they're coming in for a landing? So in other words, these problems of perceiving over time were always there, but it doesn't really come to fruition until 1966, and then the last book in 1979.
I'm so glad you brought that up. I'd love to read that book about the car. I didn't know about that. But is
Yes.
it even out? Is it available anymore?
No, it's not a book. It's an article.
It's an article. Okay.
Yeah.
And
Uh,
I did know about the flight stuff because I think a lot of that, you can see a lot of that if you look in the books of, he was really, it's not just a thought experiment.
hmm,
He was trying to understand the way things were happening.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And
And-
and so you give me far too much credit, by the way, but I'm hopefully just trying to
I don't
carry
think
some
so,
ideas.
Harry. I mean, that paper's made a big difference
Yeah.
for a lot of people. And you
Well,
know
that's
how
nice.
much I care about this bridging of seeming opposites, and that's definitely a really good academic example of
Yeah.
perspective shifting. So these things matter. It's not just
Mhm.
flattery. I really think they matter over time. It's just sometimes it takes so long for them to really be visible.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what's gratifying to me is that some of my younger colleagues are appreciating it now. But I don't think my work was given all that much attention for a long time. So that happens.
Do you feel like you've understood better? I mean, I wanted to ask you, why did you want to understand how to make place better for children? Why was that so early? Because even some of your last papers, which I didn't get to talk to, but the ones in the last 10, 15 years where you do really interesting stuff in different collaborations about how children are in their environments or how they make them sustainable. I can't remember all the titles now, but you're still doing it and following through on that. Where did that come from? And
Well,
how do you feel about that trajectory?
I said at the very beginning, Earth Day occurred when I was just finishing undergraduate studies, and environmental activism was really what people, well, environmental, anti-war, and women's rights
But
were.
why kids? Because you
Yeah,
were a kid still, or
say that
why
again.
children? Why children? Why you just thought that's
That's a,
where it matters most?
yeah, because the early what we've known within psychology for a long time is the early years are formative. And now the notion of brain plasticity is non-controversial, but back then the thought was, our kids kind of born and pre-wired to engage the world in certain ways, and there's a lot of skepticism and at the time, and in this, with the skepticism comes the question: well, do the environments then matter that kids are growing up in? Is it going to affect how they develop? So that's kind of where I came in. But again, I was interested in, well, how can we change? It's students of the '60s and early '70s is like, well, how can we change things to make them better? And that went out of fashion for a long time, but I think it's come back now. So that's kind of where I started.
How do you think that affordances are phenomenological and environmental? I mean, do you think we can change our affordances through kind of attention in the way that we've been discussing? Or have you seen it happen over all these years? Or
We can
what's
change. Well, we change affordances all the time because we alter the environment. Yeah,
it's
and
always
and and in
happening
that,
both ways, huh?
well,
Changes
and
us and we're changing it. And
yeah, I mean, I mean, the concept that many people might be familiar with now, which is came up really about 10 years ago, is the idea of niche construction. That organisms alter their habitat to better live in it. All organisms do that, and so do we. And in doing that, what we do is we change the available affordances of the environment. Yeah.
so do you think in thinking about this problem of how we find meaning through perceptual experience, just by putting attention on this and understanding this process, that we might, if we try to nest all of this in different ways, it is a different kind of world and lived experience of the world. At least I think of it like that. Do you connect the work you've been doing and these ideas to those, the bigger place where you started with something like Earth Day and really trying to think of what self and Earth are in a different way? Is that too sentimental? Or
No, because what we haven't mentioned at all in this conversation, which was understandable, is what I've done with most of my time over the past 50 years. I spent 42 years teaching at an undergraduate college.
the same
Every,
one since 1976.
yeah, exactly. And I saw teaching undergraduates is not only teaching some basic things about psychology and so on, but also making them aware of the world we live in, and hopefully making them more sensitive to the ways in which the environment is changing. And like 25 years ago, I had to argue with them to convince them that, yeah, the climate's changing. Here's the data. And there's a lot of resistance to climate change for reasons that I don't have to go into. And now, 40 years later, of course, it's changing. We've known this all along. Yeah. So teaching is crucial. And in my role as a teacher, I tried to inform my students about what was going on in the world around them. Yeah. In fact, frankly, that was more important than teaching them psychology, because again, they're undergraduates. Most of them are not going to go on to have careers in psychology, but they are going to go on to live as citizens in a country and as business people and, whatever. And having an awareness of the dynamic changes in the environment is positive. So that was really my main commitment. And fortunately, I was able to squeeze everything else in around the corners.
I'm so glad you said that. And I mean, this is love and philosophy, and to me that feels like an act of love. I think that Gibson doing what he had to do and changing course is kind of an act of love too, but so many, and I've had a lot of discussions with a lot of famous people over my life, and they almost always end up saying it was one teacher who said one thing that sort of put them on that path. So, I mean, yes, your papers are very important. They will pass on, and you're passing on the James and the Gibson tradition in a way. But probably the most important acts of love that you did was that, right? Going to work every day and teaching and being able to kind of transmit that in little small moments.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't phrase it that way, but I think that's absolutely accurate. Yeah. I mean, I love teaching. I love being in the classroom. And even now that I'm not teaching, I'm rating every day. It, these are acts of love because that's what I do.
Yeah. And
Those activities. I mean, I could be doing other activities as acts of love. I'd be cooking for my family, and that would be an act of love, but I'm not a very good cook. I do these things. Those are my acts of love.
well, I really appreciate it. And it's meaningful, right? Back to that word meaning and all this perceptual experience. And yeah, I think it's good to at times just call it out for what it is because it matters. And young people seeing it, it's good to know that as you progress through your career, those are what matter, those moments. And coming from that place, it might not be teaching, it might be teaching, but whatever it is that feels like that, it still matters over time and space, I guess.
Yeah. No, I think so. I think so. I mean, I do have students who I've been in contact with over many decades, and hopefully that had some impact on them. I have the impression that it did. So
It did. I was just with you in Spain and I saw for myself. So
yeah, thank you.
I've witnessed it firsthand. But well, thank you. I'll let you go. We already talked a bit over time and it's been a kind of an intense talk. So I really appreciate you and I really appreciate your work. And this has just been great. And yeah.
Thank you. I've had a great time.
All right.
Take care. I hope we can stay in.
Yeah, me too. I'd love to talk to you again sometime. You've got such a huge body of work.